So winter came. Yerjan had accumulated a lot of work, and there was not enough time for projects with the Aral Sea. Drought. After the old keeper died, the weather in the region changed. Dust storms became more frequent and stronger. Drought raged. Drought began to go beyond the bottom of the Aral Sea. Dust storms became large and covered nearby cities and lasted for several days. The keepers gathered in Altai and began to perform rituals and ask the mountain for help from Jute. Winter this year started early and there was a lot of snow, which happens once every 7 years. But this year a lot fell and it was constantly snowing. Yerzan at home turned on the TV. The news was on. Journalist Svetlana, with whom he was on an expedition to the Aral Sea, was filming a report in the steppes. They showed videos of animals frozen from the cold. There were wolves, hares, sagas frozen in the snow, birds falling from the sky. The animals froze in unnatural poses on the move, froze from the cold, which was not noticed before. Also, domestic animals and even people who were on the road froze. The fault of this was Jude. Usually, he did not appear in winter, but this year, after the keeper died and another had not yet been found, there was no factor holding it back, and he, Jude, went beyond the boundaries of his territory and arranged snowstorms and blizzards and took his harvest. Therefore, nature revolted against this, and an invisible war was going on against man. There was a lot of snow in Altai this year. In some places there were 2 meters. Houses were under the snow, and people were digging themselves out every day to clean the roof and feed the animals. There were no roads. Everything was under the snow. That was the case throughout Kazakhstan. Flooding. By the end of winter, as expected, the snow began to melt and floods began, и в тот же день начали поступать новости о том, что зимой либо аул, либо окраины городов были затоплены и начали уходить под воду. In early March, more than 100,000 homes were underwater in northern Kazakhstan. Rivers overflowed their banks, and reservoirs turned into large lakes. In the spring of 2024, when snow began to melt in Kazakhstan, large-scale floods began. The director summoned Erjan and Kanat and said that a commission on emergency situations had been created in connection with the floods, and he was including them in this commission since specialists in the water industry were needed. Erzan and Kanat agreed. They went to North Kazakhstan to study the scale of the flood and understand how to tame the elements. After studying the situation, Yerzhan came to the conclusion that the largest volume of water is concentrated in the Yesil Reservoir, into which all the meltwater from the central mountains and steppes of Kazakhstan flows. It was known that the Turgay Depression was nearby, a sparsely populated area experiencing an acute shortage of water, ideally suited for the transfer of surpluses. Redirecting water from the Yesil Reservoir to the Turgay Depression could solve the problem of floods, from which many cities and towns of Kazakhstan suffered. Meltwater flowing from the mountains overflowed the Yesil Reservoir, which flowed into the Sergeyevskoye Reservoir, on which a dam stood and fixed the overflow. Yerzhan and Kanat stood on the bridge of the Sergeyevsky Reservoir and looked at the sea that had formed in front of them and overflowed over the dam on which the hydroelectric power station stood and held back this water. The end of this water was not visible. The snow was melting and arriving every minute. The bridge and the dam held back all this water. If it does not withstand, it will wash away the entire village which was located behind the bridge. Every day the overflow level rose and at the end of March reached the 3-meter mark. The water, in turn, went further into Russia, flowed into the Irtysh, flooding cities downstream, and then went further into the Arctic Ocean. This runoff of meltwater could be redirected into the Turgai Depression and a canal could be created. This seemed like an ideal solution. Inspired, Yerjan and Kanat began to study the area in order to determine the optimal direction for water drainage from the Yesil Reservoir into the Turgai Depression. During the research, they met a local resident who told them about a gorge between the mountains, located not far from the reservoir. A canal could be dug between the mountains to transfer water to the Turgai Depression. The height of the mountain was 20 to 30 meters, and the length was about 100 meters. The laying of the canal should not have been expensive. Water arrived every day and flooded new settlements that would have to be restored. Erjan and Kanat began to persuade officials from the emergency commissions about the need to transfer water from the Yesil Reservoir to the Turgai Depression. Akimats gave consent. Svetlana, having arrived at the scene, made a report on television. Many people supported the project, but it turned out that in the event of water entering the Turgai Depression, 2 small villages would be under threat of flooding. The residents of the villages were ready to move, but demanded compensation for the lost housing. The Akimat promised to find funds to pay compensation so that people could start a new life in another place. The commission, which included Yerjan and Kanat, needed to save people from the flood, and on the other hand, prevent an environmental disaster. Yerjan, having weighed all the pros and cons, suggested, after all, to dig a canal through the mountain and drain the meltwater through this canal into the Turgai Depression in order to save the already flooded houses and the houses that were under threat of flooding. After the water recedes, the government will be able to deal with the restoration of houses. It was important to act quickly to avoid new casualties and destruction. Yerjan justified to the Commission on the Liquidation of the Emergency that it was necessary to urgently begin work with the involvement of equipment to remove soil from the mountain for the construction of a canal to transfer water, which was arriving more and more. He understood that it was necessary to carefully study the area in order to predict the consequences of transferring water to the Turgai Depression. Having agreed with the construction company, they brought in equipment and began to lay the canal. A week after the work, after 90% of the earthworks had been done, it became clear that digging further was dangerous. The dam could collapse and all the equipment would be washed away by the water flow. Demolition experts were called in who were supposed to blow up the remains of the mountain. 5 charges were set and a powerful explosion thundered. Water, like an enraged beast, rushed into the channel that they had dug. The width of the channel was about 30 meters and the depth of the channel was about 3 meters. About 2 billion cubic meters of water have accumulated in the Yesil Reservoir, and it was still arriving with the melting of the snow. A heavy flow rushed into the canal, and from the canal the water gushed out as if from a pipe, filling the Turgai Depression. Water quickly reached the abandoned settlements, located a few kilometers from each other, and began to flood the houses. Soon, a depression tens of kilometers long and about 5 kilometers wide turned into a huge lake. Half of the water from the Yesil Reservoir went into the Turgai Depression. The dam on the Sergeyevsky Reservoir overflowed with a historical mark of 4. 5 meters, which was dangerous. It could not withstand and instantly flood all the villages and cities behind it, so the commission and workers worked day and night. After the water was drained in the Torgay, the level of the mark began to fall, and the water level in the flooded areas in the north of Kazakhstan also began to gradually fall. People, seeing that the water was receding from their houses, rejoiced. While the Turgay depression was filling with water, there was still ice in the Yesil reservoir. Ice flows floated towards the Sergievskaya Dam, but reaching the canal, they seemed to obey an invisible force and turned left towards the Turgay depression. A large ice floe about 30 meters wide got stuck in the channel, blocking the flow of water. However, after 10 minutes, under the pressure of the water, the ice floe broke through the barrier and rushed on, destroying the banks of the channel. The channel became even wider and more powerful. This huge ice floe, weighing tens of tons like a battering ram, smashed everything in its path. When the water flooded the last settlement in the Turgay Valley, there was one person who did not have time to leave his home. He managed to take out his whole family, but forgot the documents at home and returned for them. At that moment, the water covered the village. He climbed onto the roof of his house and watched as all the houses around were sinking. A terrible picture opened before him, which he would never forget. Suddenly, he saw a huge block of ice rushing towards him, scattering houses like splinters. Hair stood on end, and he realized that this was the end. Mentally saying goodbye to his family, he decided at the last moment to move to the ice floe. When the ice floe approached his house, he jumped from the roof onto it. At the same moment, his house collapsed and disappeared under the water, and he stayed on the ice floe, sailed on towards the Aral Sea. Yerzhan, Kanat, and Svetlana were driving towards the Aral Sea. They decided to go to Aral, and in that place where they expected the water from the Turgay to reach the Aral Sea to film this. This was a historical moment of the water flowing from the Turgay depression into the Aral Sea. The idea seemed good to them. They were sitting in the car and waiting for the water from the Turgay to reach the Aral. Suddenly they heard a loud roar and noise. Looking towards the Turgay depression, they saw a huge wall of water approaching them. They did not expect. They thought the water should pass not far from them, but the water came right to the place where they stopped. They understood that they could be flooded and carried away into the Aral Sea, but as bad luck would have it, at that moment the car got stuck and began to skid. Yerzhan and Kanat got out and began to push the car. Svetlana sat behind the wheel. The car, getting stuck in the mud, slowly began to get out of the mud, and feeling solid ground, Svetlana floored it. The water from the Turgay was quickly approaching. Svetlana stopped and waited, looking in the rearview mirror, when Yerzhan and Kanat ran up and jumped into the car, sharply accelerated the car, and they rushed away from the approaching elements. Svetlana, trembling with fear, tried to film what was happening with one hand, but her hands wouldn't obey her. Kanat silently looked out the window, realizing the scale of what had been done. He felt both relief and horror. Relief from the fact that it was possible to prevent a catastrophe in the north, and horror at the thought that they could have drowned. The long-awaited moment has come. The Turgay River, reinforced by a powerful flow from the Turgay depression, flowed into the Aral Sea. The once shallow coast came to life again. The water was rising rapidly, returning life to the once extinct sea. Yerzhan, Kanat, and Svetlana stood on the shore, Watching this miracle, they understood that this was only a temporary solution to the problem, but believed that it would give time to develop more long-term measures to save the Aral Sea. Here, they noticed an ice floe floating in the distance and a man on it who was being carried away into the open sea. Yerjan contacted the rescue service. They promised to send help. An hour later, a helicopter arrived, took them on board, and they flew to look for the man on the ice floe.